The thermal overlay of Xylem 4's upper hemisphere stuttered in shades of orange and black, pulsing like a cauterized wound on the central console. Dr. Arik Meldron stood in Proteus 1's command chamber, jaw locked, arms folded tight across his pressure vest. Below them, hundreds of micro-deployment drones were already cutting through the low atmosphere, seeding the first phase of atmospheric correction. The feedback streams were worse than expected. Methane saturation tenfold baseline, root systems collapsed, 5-year oxygen dropout curve imminent. But that wasn't what had his teeth grinding. It was the timestamps. The drones had launched automatically on orbit lock, coded under Clause 14.7b. Humanitarian assistance authorized in disaster-classified zones lacking sovereign resistance. But the biosphere hadn't collapsed recently. According to multi-layer spectral decay, it had begun failing 6 years ago, slowly, deliberately. And the signal they'd received 2 weeks earlier, the one that triggered the entire mission, had been fragmented. Tri-source verified, yes, but fragmented. Now real-time cross-analysis showed the ecosystem didn't just need help. It had been left to die in isolation, left just long enough for someone to watch it die. He tapped into the AI interface. Override auto-seed routines, lock deployment to Phase 1 only. The drones slowed mid-descent. Too late for retraction, but early enough to prevent full biome override. The damage was minimal. Early oxygen boosters had already started catalyzing upper atmo breakdown. It was just enough to trigger a statistical lift in native survivability curves. He stared at it for a long second, then turned to the officer on his left. Flag it. Passive fallback protocols. No advanced structures, no terraforming threads. We hold the line. Behind him, the chamber's back wall displayed a slowly resolving visual. Xylem 4, as surfaced through filtered atmospheric lensing. Arid ridges stretched across dead river deltas, sand-blasted highlands choked with fungal overgrowth. And dotted between them, the faint flicker of solar receptors embedded in Van-style energy nodes. Not standard, not salvage, not refugee-built. Official. Meldron exhaled through his nose, then spoke, his voice flat. Get me the original authorization packet. Now. His mind was already running back through the council chamber. Earth's Foreign Aid Council had reviewed the data stream in open quorum. It was a clean vote, unanimous authorization. The signal, though degraded, contained time-stamped planetary distress codes matching Seraphine collapse protocols. Cross-checking against known skirmish zones, Xylem 4 matched a dead system. Catalogued under non-aligned conflict, believed uninhabited post-evacuation. Perfect fit, low risk, high need. They had launched under full compact compliance. No member system had contested, no warnings flagged. Which meant one thing. The Van wanted them here. The diplomatic AI pinged once. Transmission flagged, foreign doctrine tag identified. On screen, the compact overlay unfolded, a slow crawl of untranslated Van symbols, rotating in 4-layer recursive syntax. Meldron waited as the AI decrypted line by line. It wasn't a declaration of war, it wasn't even formal rejection. It was something stranger. Sacrilege Protocol 3, external contamination of divine isolation zone constitutes spiritual defilement. Observers will be tested. Response will be absolute. He muttered to himself, defilement, then tapped again, bringing up the Van doctrine archives, religious codices, celestial border decrees, ecological containment rituals. He scanned the entries until one locked onto a match. Quarantined holy biomes, testing boundaries of faith. These weren't just abandoned systems, they were theological containment zones, created not to protect life but to see who would violate it. We've been baited, he said quietly. They didn't need help. They wanted to know who would answer. A comms officer turned. Sir, incoming contact, unscheduled vessel breaching orbit. How fast? 3.4 minutes to low orbit. Heat signatures. Van Priest cruiser, cloaked until 30 seconds ago. Meldron didn't move. Of course it was fast. Too fast for response. Too fast for coincidence. They had already been waiting. Watching. Don't raise shields, he said. Keep us soft. Civilian pattern. Transmit Compact Clause 14.7b with diagnostic overlays. Include passive-only fallback status. The AI complied, streaming terabytes of ecosystem diagnostics, drone overlays, and legal verification. None of it would matter. The priest cruiser broke the clouds like a hammerhead, angled bow glinting black under the twin suns, temple lattice architecture curling over its forward emitter banks. It bore no national ID, no transponder ping, just carved scripture along the hull, doctrine symbols etched into the metal as though cut by fire. Then the forward beam split open, not toward orbit, but toward the surface. Meldron watched as the first drone fields blinked off the network. The Varn weren't targeting ships, they were erasing the aid. Each drone disintegrated in a flash of engineered plasma, harmless to living tissue, useless against metal hulls, but lethal to high-sensitivity climate stabilizers. In seconds, entire clusters of soil converters and seed dispersers vanished in white fire. The biomes that had just begun responding fell silent again. The comms officer turned pale. "They're purging the healing zones." Meldron didn't raise his voice. "They're not responding to diplomacy. They're defending doctrine." Another drone blinked out, then another. Over 70% of Phase 1 deployment was gone. He turned to the systems operator. "Initiate containment sequence. Lock all remaining drones into dormant hold. Full system quarantine. Zero response threshold. Then prep cascade." The operator blinked. "Sir, that's escalation." "No, that's classification." His voice sharpened. "If they're going to destroy us for stabilizing soil, then we answer with scale, not violence, precision." The screen went dark. Another drone field vanished, nothing left but scorched growth where it had begun to bring green. And above them, the Varn ship circled once. The message was clear. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come to kill the proof that something else could work. The Neumann Cascade Protocol wasn't built for diplomacy. It was built for scale, not a weapon, not aggressive, just inevitable. Once triggered, it seeded itself outward from surviving units like a fractal, each aid beacon duplicating only when tethered to active biome collapse markers. It couldn't be ordered to stop, couldn't be redirected, couldn't even be hacked. Each beacon carried its own encrypted logic core, encoded with the same narrow legal directives. Stabilize oxygen, rebalance microflora, protect fauna vectors. Nothing more, nothing less. Once it started, it didn't ask permission. It just ran the numbers, and if the decay was above threshold, it acted. Meldron gave the order with the calm precision of someone who'd written the policy himself. One tap, no announcement, no fanfare, one command, and the surviving beacons still in atmospheric drift flipped from standby to active recursion. Across the lower continent, the code activated in silence. Beacons began deploying lateral seed subunits, tethered drones with replication trees no larger than a seed pod. They spread through fungal fields, latched onto petrified wood, sank into soil cracks, and began feeding nutrients back into sterilized earth. In 20 hours, 9 new stabilization points emerged. In 36, it was 16. By the end of the third day, there were 43, none of them manned, none of them broadcasting. They didn't need to. Each one was a closed-loop system, evaluating biosphere conditions and deploying repairs, and for the first time in years the surface of Xylem 4 began to breathe. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flowers blooming overnight, no verdant forests springing from ash. But in a 3-kilometer stretch near the southern Rift Valley, the air temperature dropped 2 degrees. Local spores, once lethal, began receding. Ground scanners picked up water retention in topsoil. And most importantly, refugees stopped moving. The first cluster was accidental. Migrants fleeing the previous Varn-ordered quarantine zone had been in motion for weeks, heading toward a supposedly sacred extraction point. When they passed through the fringe of a newly formed beacon site, they paused. Oxygen levels were tolerable. The ground didn't crack underfoot. One child, no older than 5, exhaled for the first time without a pressure mask, and didn't start coughing. They stayed. Within 12 hours, others joined them. Word spread. No official broadcasts, just movement. Dozens of smaller bands began deviating from known evacuation routes, shifting toward beacon zones. The Proteus fleet's passive scanners caught it all. Thermal trails, pulse readings, infant blood gas analysis from a stolen Van medical tent, chlorophyll bands climbing, air toxicity dropping. Meldron watched from orbit as the fleet's data feeds began contradicting the Van's official public statements. According to them, the region was still dying, but from above, it was stabilizing itself 1 decimal at a time. The Van reacted exactly as expected, not with admission, but with dogma. High-orbit relay captured a planetary broadcast, crimson glyphs cycling across their satellite web, all repeating the same warning. The Mercy Plague is false salvation. Reject the foreign seed. They didn't target ships, didn't demand withdrawal. They aimed lower. Flyers began dropping doctrinal leaflets over stabilization zones. Temple drones issued scripted proclamations. Sermons were transmitted across the local band, condemning the mathematical blasphemy of unauthorized balance. Meldron didn't flinch. He ordered full documentation release to compact channels. Every system with a relay beacon within 2 parsecs received live feed overlays, comparing child lung scans before and after exposure, showing soil pH normalization curves, mapping insect population returns. Nothing editorialized, just data, just truth. Then came the broadcast collapse. It was mid-transmission. A Van theological official, one of the senior purifiers, stood at the center of a ritual platform, denouncing Earth's machines, claiming divine contamination. His voice thundered through the pulpit drones, vibrating with conviction, until it didn't. Mid-sentence, he stumbled, a cough, then another, the AI tracking the stream flag. At a sudden saturation drop in carbon monoxide, an unintended side effect of the nearby stabilization node just 3 kilometers away. The air had cleared, just enough. His lungs, unused to breathable levels of oxygen, spasmed. He dropped to one knee, choking on clean air. No toxin, no attack, just environmental integrity he wasn't physically adapted for. Med drones rushed him off screen. The broadcast cut to static. The footage was clipped, repeated, and distributed in under 2 hours. That was the moment the Van began losing control, not through sabotage, not through rebellion, but through visibility. The people saw something they weren't meant to, their spiritual authority, overwhelmed by purity it couldn't tolerate. Meanwhile, beacon clusters began reaching auto-threshold for next-tier replication. Proteus systems tried issuing a hold signal, but they were ignored, not by malfunction, by design. Neumann cascade logic trees recognized compact clause precedents. The beacon fields weren't bound to Proteus anymore. They were bound to biosphere classification laws. The only way to stop them would be to kill the land faster than it could heal, and the Van couldn't move that quickly without proving what they truly were. Then, without transmission, without protocol, a Van scout vessel made its choice. The ship was small, one of the perimeter monitors assigned to tracking atmospheric shifts. It had been silent for days. No comms, no pings. But then, as a new stabilization field bloomed near the central ridge, it broke formation, dropped below satellite masking, and killed its own transponder. Proteus watched in silence as it descended. No challenge, no contact. The vessel cut its engines at 70 meters and drifted silently into a clearing where new trees had begun punching up through the dry earth. It landed gently. Rear hatch opened. 2 figures stepped out. They carried no weapons. They didn't raise hands. They just stood there, breathing the air. Meldron watched the footage from orbit. No orders given, no orders needed. He spoke only once. "They're not defecting," he said quietly. "They're just done running." The first application came from a dying moon. Not a Van outpost, not a rebel sanctuary, just a rock called Diron 5, where atmospheric regulators had collapsed 5 years prior. Its biosphere had fallen below sustainable thresholds 6 months earlier, but the local clergy, afraid of political repercussions, had declared the suffering ritual purification. When Proteus initiated its controlled sanctuary protocol, Diron Five's Provisional Council submitted a formal request, not to ear, not to the compact, but directly into the algorithm. Meldron didn't design the protocol to make moral judgments. It wasn't supposed to weigh desperation against devotion. The intake system evaluated entropy rates, pure, unweighted decay vectors. It looked at how close a biosphere was to terminal collapse and assigned access to the stabilization corridors based on the urgency of that decline. The system didn't ask if the petitioners believed in Earth or in the compact or in the Varn gods. It just asked, is the land dying faster than you can stop it? If the answer was yes, the corridor opened. If no, it stayed shut. Diron 5 was approved in 14 seconds. By the end of the day, 5 more worlds had submitted requests. 3 were Varn border planets. The doctrine was cracking, not from war, from math. Within the week, the pattern emerged. Varn governors began falsifying atmospheric data, attempting to exaggerate collapse curves. Proteus's intake algorithm rejected each attempt. It didn't use their numbers. It used sensor analysis and long-term decay signatures to detect structural truth. One priest governor, desperate to gain entry for his enclave, attempted to sabotage a signal drone to distort readings. He wasn't just caught. He was caught on a live feed. The footage spread in seconds. The priest, previously revered, was dragged from his temple by his own congregation. Not executed, not punished, just left behind as they moved toward the stabilization zone that hadn't let them in, yet. The weight of access had shifted. For generations, the Varn dictated survival based on creed, ancestry, obedience. Now it was determined by photosynthesis rates. Refugees no longer chanted hymns. They studied nutrient indexes on translated Proteus dashboards. The sacred scriptures still echoed from the loudspeakers, but fewer listened. Instead, people whispered the names of beacon zones like lifeboats. Meldron's face was now passed through broken projector feeds, not as a messiah, as a technician. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it reached farther than the Varn High Council's decrees. His first public statement came 5 days into the protocol rollout. Broadcast from orbit, grainy but unedited, his voice came through steady and cool. Stability is not ideology, he said. It is sequence. The land doesn't care who speaks over it. It answers only to balance. That phrase hit harder than any weapon. Varn clergy scrambled to adapt. New interpretations were issued. Counter-scriptures tried to reframe the stabilization zones as tests of piety, that only the faithful would survive under foreign contamination. But it was too late. When people watched their children breathe without struggle, when crops emerged where only dust had lived, no sermon could compete with that. The Proteus corridors expanded again, but not through conquest. They rotated. Sanctuary zones shifted every 72 hours, forming a constantly rebalancing grid. No permanent sanctuary existed. It was dynamic, forcing migration patterns to follow ecological health. Refugee camps became moving cities, drone-guided paths marked by invisible atmospheric gradients threaded through the worst terrain and guided survivors toward temporary equilibrium. Proteus had created something new, survival by adaptation, without loyalty. Varn officials declared an emergency summit. 17 sectors convened in orbit above Trinex 9, hoping to stabilize doctrine. They arrived divided, unsure whether to escalate or reform. While they debated symbols, another enclave broke ranks, not with banners, not with protest, but by silence. A full planetary district disconnected from the Varn network and routed all transmissions through Proteus corridors. They didn't issue demands, they didn't declare independence, they simply stopped listening. That was the real defeat. Not rebellion, irrelevance. The final confirmation came from the east spiral of the Tritian Plains. Once a holy route for Varn pilgrims, marked by centuries of ritual paths and symbolic fasts, it had now become a dry corridor. Stabilization drones had rerouted around it, intentionally avoiding sacred ground out of compact respect protocols. Yet the pilgrims didn't follow the old way. They broke ranks, turned south, and moved instead toward a secondary beacon zone forming on the plains periphery. When questioned, one of them answered plainly, "There's food there." From orbit, satellite imagery captured the shift. A 1,000-year pilgrimage route bent like a vine, coiling around New Green. The change wasn't ordered, it wasn't strategic, it was primal. They weren't choosing a side, they were choosing survival. And for the first time, the doctrine had nothing left to offer. The Axiom Lance entered the Tharis II system like a final sentence. It needed no escort, no announcement. The ship itself was a relic of a different kind of war, older than the Proteus Initiative, older even than the Vaan's current generation of priest commanders. The lance was the blade they had unsheathed 3 times in the last century, each time followed by mass silence from the systems it visited. Entire orbital rings had vanished under its purification arrays. Its approach didn't trigger panic, it triggered history repeating. The message was clear: this would not be a debate. This would be ritual. It arrived above Tharis II 3 hours after the first stabilization corridor expanded into the planet's inner valley. A population of 24 million had been marked for selective extraction. Proteus drones had reached only a fraction of them before the Lance entered synchronous orbit. The local beacon networks picked up its drive signature before the visual did, but it made no attempt to hide. Its hull glowed with ritual burnish, etched lines of Vaan theological code, each one marking a prior cleansing. No weapons were locked, no warnings sent, because the Lance never asked. In the Proteus fleet, no alarm sounded. Meldron stood at the core data interface, unmoving. He watched the telemetry unfold with no more emotion than a mathematician reviewing a known equation. He gave no counter-command, no fleet maneuver, no formation protocols. Instead, he instructed a junior officer to execute precedent-indexed logic chain transmission. The command was sent through diplomatic channels, not to the Vaan, but to the 5 compact oversight satellites positioned across the border systems. Compact law was clear: planetary systems containing open medical infrastructure, neutral humanitarian assets, and civilian-directed stabilization protocols were protected under Article 9. An attack on them was not war. It was classified as cross-species sabotage. The satellites responded. Not with force, but with silence. The kind of silence that rewrites consequences. The Lance's drive arrays dimmed, its automated targeting subsystems locked by external override. The purification array, once primed to release ionized fire across the low atmosphere, froze mid-cycle. Not because the Lance failed, but because it had entered a system that no longer belonged to the Vaan, or the Compact, or Earth. It belonged to protocol. Inside the Lance, chaos bloomed. The ship's bridge was built for ritual command, not operational debate. Orders filtered through layers of doctrinal hierarchy. But the command tree fractured when it faced reality. External override logs streamed into the Lance's core, showing the legal breach in quantifiable detail. Multiple systems cross-confirmed, 5 independent validation streams, all verifying that the Lance's current position, above a stabilization zone, rendered its armament illegal by treaty. There was no enemy, no declaration, just law. The High Priest Commander refused to retreat. He ordered the override severed. Technicians refused. One engineer rerouted atmospheric processors away from military decks and into civilian hold areas, giving priority to the pilgrims trapped inside who had already begun to suffer oxygen drift from stationary position. Another opened a private channel, unsecured, low band, but wide enough to leak. The stream reached Proteus within minutes. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't a cry for help. It was raw data. Heat maps, medical scans, oxygen saturation, blood oxygenation crashes, and an index of all non-combatants currently aboard the ship. Then the second transmission came. A junior soldier, barely out of Ritual Academy, spoke directly to the camera. "We were told we would cleanse heresy. There is no heresy here, only clean air." He paused, then continued, trembling slightly. "They told us the mercy plague was poison, but my sister was healed by it on Siren 3. We lied. We all knew." The broadcast cut off, but not before it was copied, rerouted, amplified. Across the quadrant, viewers watched live as the most feared weapon in the Varn arsenal sat powerless in orbit, not because it had been defeated, but because it had no authority to move. The doctrine could not override the code. The Varn leadership responded with fury. Within the hour, blackout orders were issued, communications were severed, local system relays were purged, archives deleted, but it was already too late. Compact citizens had downloaded the entire sequence. Refugee worlds had seen it live. The priest commander's image, raging behind a pulpit as his command staff quietly transferred aid schedules to Earth systems, circulated across every network that had once feared him. Meldron never spoke. Not once. He didn't need to. The image of the Axiom Lance, once an icon of terror, now paralyzed above a planet breathing without prayer, said more than words ever could. The ship wasn't destroyed. It wasn't boarded. It wasn't even touched. It had simply become irrelevant. And for the first time in Varn history, the people saw that irrelevance and chose not to look away. The Axiom Lance remained in orbit, inert and untouched, like a monument to a god that no longer answered prayers. With its failure came a silence that spread faster than any broadcast. Varn colonies, long ruled by fear of ecological collapse and the promise of divine intervention, suddenly found themselves staring at an undeniable truth. The worst had already happened, and Earth hadn't punished them for it. It had healed the ground beneath their feet, quietly, consistently, without sermon, without demand. In dozens of systems, bureaucratic paralysis took hold. Command centers issued no new edicts. Supply chains stuttered, not from sabotage, but from hesitation. The old faith had demanded obedience under threat of famine, drought, or breathless suffocation. But the refugees who had stepped inside the perimeter of a Proteus corridor no longer needed permission to survive. They just needed chlorophyll readings and soil temperature indexes. The doctrine collapsed not from attack, but from obsolescence. Requests for Proteus stabilization began to arrive not from rebel governors or broken priesthoods, but from civilians, teachers, and former clerics who simply wanted to stop watching their children choke. Meldron refused to centralize. Every intake was rerouted through local provisional councils, elected ad hoc by refugee clusters, many of whom had never voted in their lives. These weren't political structures. They were functional responses. Who knew where to find clean water? Who had mapped the last safe paths? Who could calibrate the rebalancer drones? These people weren't trained. They were necessary. Meldron allowed the sanctum zones to persist, but rotated them by ecological priority, forcing even newly stabilized communities to participate in migration and mutual resource tracking. No protection was permanent. No zone was privileged. The system taught its own logic. Those who learned to adapt endured. Those who waited for authority fell behind. The Compact issued limited recognitions, not of Earth as a conquering entity, but of Proteus as an infrastructure sovereign. No vote, no flag, no representative, just a legal designation, non-aligned, neutral, and outside political reach. Earth did not object. Meldron did not respond. The Varn High Council, reduced now to a dozen fractured voices, released a final purge broadcast. It ran across all public networks they still controlled. It condemned Proteus. It condemned Earth. It called the stabilization corridors false sanctuaries and declared all who entered them exiled from eternal return. In years past, such a decree would have triggered riots. Now it triggered laughter. In 57 systems once locked by faith, the message was not replayed, not argued, not even mocked. It was ignored. Children sat in open-air shelters assembled by Proteus drones, taking lessons on rainfall cycles and fungal resistance curves. Former temples, once lined with votive fires and sacred breathless rites, now stored water purification tablets and translated botany guides. The sermons had ended, not because they were defeated, but because no one showed up to hear them. And still, Meldron remained off-screen. His name appeared in system overlays, tagged to ecological updates and corridor rotations. But no interviews surfaced, no declarations were made. He issued no statements of victory, Only an update once every 6 days. Status report, corridor direction, estimated photosynthesis saturation for zones under restoration. The world didn't need to see him. The math was already doing the speaking. In one system, once a Van pilgrimage site known as Tresca's Vale, a theologian emerged from years of exile. He had refused to denounce the purge. He had buried disciples who suffocated in failed sanctuaries. He had waited for divine retribution. Instead, he found children planting nutrient vines under filtered sun. He stood beside a Proteus oxygen tree, grown in silence, its roots uncoiling through the ash of burned temple grounds, and stared at the purity monitor embedded in its bark. 74% saturation, enough for an entire village to breathe unaided. He knelt, not in prayer. He pulled his scripture scroll from his robes, the same one he had carried through 2 decades of pilgrimage, copied by hand in his youth. And he burned it, not from bitterness, not as surrender. He wept, not because the gods had failed, but because they were never necessary in the first place. All that suffering, all that devotion, when what they needed had been algorithm, not altar. That was the final wound. The faith hadn't been crushed. It had starved itself to death. The compact gathered without ceremony. No press, no declarations, just silent envoys arriving from fractured systems, orbiting former war zones, and halls once ruled by doctrine. There were no banners, there was no applause. The matter before them wasn't war or surrender, it was classification. What, exactly, had the Proteus initiative become? The Earth delegation didn't contest. Meldron didn't attend. A proxy AI carried the motion packet filed under Clause 16.2a of the Neutral Operations Codex. After 2 days of silent review, the Compact voted, not on sanctions, not on membership, but on recognition. The Proteus initiative was no longer considered a humanitarian fleet. It was designated a strategic, non-aligned infrastructure entity. Not an ally, not a threat, just a new category, one built because the old ones had failed to account for it. Earth would no longer be held responsible for Proteus's actions, and Proteus, by design, would no longer answer to Earth. The designation freed Meldron before anyone realized it had. He submitted his final command sequence 3 hours later. It wasn't dramatic. No speech, no footage, just a system-wide update that transitioned administrative authority over corridor access to an adaptive rotational matrix, built to respond to entropy curves and biosphere viability without human input. The algorithm could run itself now. The stabilizers needed no instruction. The sanctum shifted with ecological precision, no intervention required. And so he left. No one saw him go. There were no final broadcasts, no commemorative ceremonies. A search through Compact archives would show a gap. His last physical login, a brief system sync from Proteus Core Node 3, time-stamped and unsigned. His quarters aboard the lead vessel were found empty a week later. The cot made, the screens wiped. In his personal database, only one entry remained. Protocol complete, human intervention no longer necessary. The myth began before his disappearance had time to settle. Across the former Van colonies, his name became something else, sometimes spoken as a ghost, sometimes not spoken at all. Children in the stabilization corridors studied rainfall cycles and oxygenation protocols, not because they believed in Meldron, but because their parents had told them it worked. New communities formed around metrics, not belief. Maps no longer marked holy sites. They marked yield curves. No one declared peace. No treaties were signed. But war itself became a different equation. In the wake of Proteus, military planners recalibrated their simulations. No longer did they calculate territory, faith, or political will. They calculated entropy impact, how many sanctums would be destabilized by orbital fire, how many drone corridors would be disrupted. Conflict required justification now, not of ideology, but of ecological cost. Some worlds built monuments, none bore his face. One planted a stabilization tree, encased the root node in glass, and etched a simple inscription in multiple languages. We were not saved. We were given tools. We chose not to die. The final image came from a settlement once called Virak Skar, a name it no longer used. A child no older than 6 knelt in the red-brown soil beneath a pale sky just beginning to return its blue. She planted a tree, not a ritual tree, not a sacred one, just a native species that grew best under stabilized temperatures. The soil had been purified by a beacon 2 years prior. The climate was now self-sustaining. She didn't know about Arik Meldron. She didn't know about the compact vote or the war that never officially ended. She didn't need to. All she knew was that the tree would grow, and that this time, no one would make her leave. What do you think? Is this the future of power? When survival no longer needs flags and truth is carried by algorithms instead of armies, who really rules? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you trust a system like Proteus, or does a mission without leaders still need someone to answer for it? Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.